I wasn't just uninvited. They planned an entire wedding pretending I didn't exist and told people I wouldn't understand anyway. She didn't even look at me. The last time I spoke to Emma, she said, "Dad, it's probably better if you don't come. People would ask questions, and I don't want to explain you being there." And I believed her. And then I found out about her wedding from Facebook. And the worst part? Everyone else already knew. The notification popped up on my phone during breakfast at Mabel's Diner on a Thursday morning that started like any other. Emma Harris in a wedding dress. Emma, my daughter, standing in what appeared to be an elegant ballroom with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, arms wrapped around a young man I'd never met, both radiating the kind of pure joy I once thought would always include me anywhere in her life. I learned about my daughter's wedding from a stranger's Facebook post. Not from Emma, not from her fiancé, from a stranger, from Jessica Morrison, a woman I'd met exactly once at a charity fundraiser 2 years ago, who'd apparently been at Emma's venue tour 3 weeks earlier and thought the elegant setting was worth sharing with her social media followers. A woman who cared enough to document my daughter's happiness for the world to see, while I sat in a diner learning about the most important day of Emma's life, the same way I'd learn about a stranger's vacation photos. 2 years of silence between us. 2 years since she'd looked me in the eye in our old kitchen and said, "You broke up our family. Mom was happy. You ruined everything." 2 years since I'd tried to explain that her mother had already broken our family 3 years before I found the hotel receipts, the text messages, the credit card statements that painted a picture of a double life I'd been too trusting to see, too naive to suspect, too devoted to ever question her. But Emma was 24 then, old enough to make her own choices but young, enough to believe that marriages ended because someone decided to stop trying, not because someone decided to betray everything they'd built together over 26 years. I could feel people watching, not helping, just watching. The morning regulars at Mabel's knew our story. In a town of 12,000 people, everyone knew about the Harris divorce. Everyone had opinions about who destroyed what, who was the victim, who deserved sympathy, who had it coming. They'd watched me come in here every Tuesday and Friday for the past 2 years, eating breakfast alone, reading the paper alone, paying for my coffee alone. They'd seen me transform from the man who managed the town's biggest events to the divorced guy who eats scrambled eggs alone and avoids eye contact. I stared at the screen. My coffee went cold before I realized I was still holding it. No one asked how I found out. The particular shame of discovering your irrelevance through social media. The way it twists when you realize the person you helped bring into this world has planned their future around your absence, has built their happiness on the foundation of forgetting you exist. I'd spent most of my life creating perfect days for other families. I never imagined I'd be excluded from my own. Emma chose her mother's version of the divorce, the version where I was the villain who ended a happy marriage instead of a man who discovered his wife's 3-year affair and made the mistake of believing that truth mattered more than maintaining comfortable lies. That honesty was worth more than the illusion of harmony. She was 24 then, old enough to judge, young enough to see the world in black and white, old enough to decide that since Mom was crying and Dad was angry, Dad must be the one who caused the crying. Simple math, clear villain, easy choice. The wedding was in 8 months, according to the Facebook post. March 15th, spring wedding, exactly the kind of timing that required booking venues. 18 months in advance, which meant Emma had been planning the celebration for over a year without telling me, which meant the planning had already started, without me, long before that post ever reached my phone. I finished my coffee in silence, left exact change plus tip on the table, and walked out of Mabel's, knowing that every person in that diner was watching me leave and forming opinions about how I was handling the latest chapter in the Harris family drama. The house felt quieter than it ever had. Even the walls seemed to wait for someone who wasn't coming back. I sat in my study, surrounded by awards I'd earned for making other people's celebrations flawless. Photographs of smiling families whose most important days I'd orchestrated, venues I'd managed, events I'd saved from disaster. I knew how celebrations worked. I knew what it took to make important days look effortless. I didn't react. I remembered everything. The last real conversation we'd had, 3 months before the divorce was finalized. Emma collecting college textbooks from our old kitchen, finding me packing files from my downtown office. "Dad, why can't you just forgive her? People make mistakes." Some mistakes are choices, Emma. Your mother made a choice every day for 3 years. But you're making a choice too. You're choosing to break up our family. I'd tried to explain that it wasn't about pride. It was about not being able to look at someone who'd lied to me for 3 years and pretend that foundation was solid enough to build a future on. Every birthday gift sent and never acknowledged, every Christmas card returned unopened, every phone call that went straight to voicemail. Emma had made her choice. She stopped answering. That was answer enough. I'd respected it. What choice did I have? But something about that Facebook photo nagged at me. The venue looked familiar. Not just familiar, expensive, high-end, the kind of place that required connections and planning years in advance. The ballroom in the background had crown molding I recognized, chandeliers I'd seen before, architecture that belonged to a specific category of venue, historic properties converted to event spaces. I pulled out my laptop and searched wedding venues in their area. Found it within 10 minutes. Riverside Manor, historic property on the National Register, stunning ballroom that had hosted society weddings for 3 decades. The kind of place Emma had always dreamed about. She'd torn pictures from wedding magazines when she was 15, creating elaborate scrapbooks of someday celebrations. I clicked through their website, photos that matched Emma's post exactly. This was it. This was where my daughter was getting married. I closed the laptop and sat in the growing darkness. This wasn't my business anymore, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. 6 months later, Karen called on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was in my garden, cutting back roses that my ex-wife had planted our first year in the house. I'd kept them maintained since the divorce, partly out of habit, partly because destroying them would have felt too much like admitting defeat. Her voice was tight, stressed in a way that reminded me of our worst days. "William, I need to ask you for a favor." "What kind of favor?" "Emma's wedding venue fell through," she said quickly. Too quickly. Like she'd practiced the sentence in front of a mirror until it sounded natural. Like she'd rehearsed. The exact tone of panic without letting it bleed into desperation. Riverside Manor. Out of business. Impossible. I'd checked their history 6 months ago out of curiosity after seeing that Facebook post. They were solid, profitable, 30 years in operation, with a spotless reputation and a waiting list that stretched through the next 2 seasons. And yet Karen said it like it was fact, like she needed me to accept the panic first, before I asked questions. They lost their deposit and they're scrambling to find something else for March. March, 4 months away. Emergency territory in the wedding industry. There's a place here in town, Riverside Manor. It's exactly what she wants, but it's booked solid. I was hoping, with your connections, maybe you could make some calls. At the time, it felt harmless. A father helping his estranged daughter from a distance. I told Karen I'd see what I could do. After calls to colleagues, I found 3 possibilities and called her back. "These are all great," she said, "but Emma has her heart set on Riverside Manor." "Riverside Manor isn't available, Karen. They're booked through next year. Maybe if someone with your experience talked to them directly." I agreed to call them. I asked myself why she was calling me, of all people, after 2 years of silence. After we hung up, I sat thinking. Something didn't feel right about Karen's story. She said Emma didn't want me involved because, "You take things too personally, William. This isn't about you anymore." Karen hesitated, then added, "Emma says this is her life now. She doesn't want old family drama around." They didn't realize they'd booked the one place I'd never stopped owning. And they didn't just book it. They signed my name without knowing it. WH Properties was on the contract. My initials, my company, my building. The signature line read, "Owner Authorized Representative," and the printed name beneath it was mine. The next morning, I called Riverside Manor. Lisa, their events coordinator, was polite but firm. Fully booked for 18 months, but something she said caught my attention. "Our owner prefers that booking inquiries go through me." Owner, present tense, active involvement. Most venue owners I knew were hands-off investors. After I hung up, curiosity got the better of me. I researched the property. Changed hands 18 months ago. Previous owners sold to a private investment group. The investment group was a shell company. Real owner, WH Properties, LLC. If you know, you know. WH Properties. The letters felt familiar. Too familiar. Then I remembered why. It was mine. I sat staring at documents, trying to remember how this happened 3 years ago. Divorce proceedings, asset division. My lawyer recommended reinvesting proceeds to minimize taxes. He'd found Riverside Manor. Historic property, strong booking history. I'd agreed, sight unseen. But I'd been consumed with Emma's anger, rebuilding my life. I'd hired a property management company and never looked back. For 3 years, it generated income into an account I rarely checked. Emma was getting married at my venue, without knowing it. I called Lisa back. March 15th specifically. Is that date booked? Let me check. Yes, we have the Caldwell wedding. It's been on our books for 8 months. The Caldwell wedding. Emma's fiancé was named Caldwell. Payment received? Contract signed? Yes, sir. That single detail changed everything. There was no crisis, only a lie told calmly enough to sound real. I told Lisa I was confirming details for business associates. Then I understood. Karen needed help with something she couldn't ask for directly. Money. The wedding was expensive. Riverside Manor charged premium prices. Emma and her fiancé were young, probably stretching their budget. Karen had called hoping I'd discover the crisis and offer to pay for alternatives, or secure a discount. But there was no crisis. Just a father being manipulated into subsidizing a wedding he wasn't invited to attend. I checked my calendar. Then I closed it and opened it again. I wouldn't beg for a place in her life, but I wouldn't disappear either. I would attend Emma's wedding, not as her father. That role wasn't welcome, but as the owner of Riverside Manor. Quiet people prepare louder than they speak. I researched venue owner protocols. Most owners made brief appearances at major events. Quality control, guest satisfaction, standard practice. I called my lawyer and arranged complete discretion from the property management company. Over 3 months, I followed wedding preparations through Lisa's reports. The Caldwell wedding was developing into exactly the celebration Riverside Manor was known for. Classical elegance, careful attention, no expense spared. Emma had excellent taste. Everything reflected sophistication and style. I felt something rise in my chest. I pushed it back down. This wasn't the place. I arranged my schedule for March 15th. 1 week before the wedding, I called Lisa. I'd like to do a final walkthrough for the Caldwell wedding. This is one of our more significant bookings. Of course, Mr. Harris. I'll arrive about an hour after the ceremony begins. I would attend my daughter's wedding. As a stranger with business justification, March 15th dawned clear and warm. Exactly the kind of day Emma had probably hoped for. I drove to Riverside Manor and parked in the owner's reserved space behind the building. Dark suit, conservative tie, professional appearance that said venue management rather than wedding guest. Through the kitchen entrance, I could hear the celebration. Music, laughter, coordinated chaos executed flawlessly. Lisa met me in the corridor. Everything's going beautifully. The ceremony was lovely, and the reception is starting. I inspected operations quickly. Everything flawless. I'd like to make a brief appearance in the reception area. The ballroom was magical. Emma had transformed my venue into something stunning. Warm lighting, elegant flowers, crystal-catching chandelier light. In the center, Emma dancing with her new husband, radiating pure happiness. She looked like her mother had on our wedding day. The same joy, the same confidence, the same certainty that this was exactly how love was supposed to feel. And for a second, I wondered, did she really hate me? Or did she just hate the truth? I turned to leave, but someone called out. Excuse me. I turned, and there she was, Emma, stepping away from the dance floor. For 1 second, our eyes met. Not love, not warmth, just the same look she gave me the day she decided I didn't exist, like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. Karen was walking toward me, confused but polite. I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Are you at the venue? For a moment, I considered lying. I own Riverside Manor, I said quietly. Karen's expression shifted through recognition, confusion, understanding. This is your venue? Yes. Emma doesn't know. No. Karen looked back toward Emma, laughing with her bridesmaids, pretending she hadn't just seen me. She thinks this place was impossible to book, Karen said slowly. There was no cancellation. Karen went quiet like the room had shifted an inch. You did. This for her. I did it because she's my daughter. Karen was quiet for a moment. I watched Emma through the ballroom doors. Beautiful, happy, complete without me. Maybe someday she'll decide that families can be more complicated than right and wrong. Until then, this is enough. Thank you, Karen said quietly, for making sure her wedding was perfect. Every daughter deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day, even when her father can only watch from a distance. I started to leave. Then, Karen spoke again. I'm going to tell her. About who owns this place, about what you did. I stopped. You forgot who raised you? No. Emma remembered exactly who raised her. That was the problem. She remembered a father who chose truth over keeping peace, who exposed her mother's affair instead of protecting her illusion. You forgot what I used to do for a living. Building venues, creating perfect days, making celebrations happen smoothly, even when families were broken. Tell her or don't. Said, that's your choice. But I was here tonight, watching over her day, making sure everything was perfect. Whether she wanted me here or not. Karen nodded, tears forming. I walked out through the service entrance, leaving Emma to her celebration. 6 weeks later, Karen called. I told Emma about Riverside Manor, about who owns it, about what you did for her wedding. How did she take it? She cried, not because of me, but because she finally understood what she'd done. I waited. She said she missed you. She hated that she missed you, but she did. She wants to see you. 2 weeks later, Emma and I met for coffee at a small cafe downtown. Not Mabel's, somewhere neutral, somewhere without history. She looked nervous, younger than at her wedding. Her hands shook slightly as she stirred sugar into her latte. I owe you an apology, she said before we'd even ordered. Several apologies. You don't owe me anything, Emma. Yes, I do. You could have used the venue connection when I needed help, but you didn't because you respected my decision. You could have forced your way back into my life through this, but you didn't. That wasn't about respect, Emma. That was about love. I wanted you to have a perfect day, even if I couldn't be part of it. But you were part of it. You made it possible. And I spent 2 years convinced you were the villain in our story. We talked for 3 hours about the divorce, about choices made in anger and grief, about ways families break apart and sometimes find their way back together, about her mother's affair, about my decision to leave rather than pretend, about the pain of being 24 and watching your parents' marriage explode and needing someone to blame. It wasn't complete healing. Relationships broken for 2 years don't fix themselves in one conversation over coffee and apologetic tears, but it was a beginning. A tentative step toward understanding that families are more complicated than heroes and villains. That love sometimes looks like walking away, and that sometimes it looks like quietly ensuring the aisle exists, even when you're not invited to walk down it. 6 months later, Emma invited me to dinner at her new house. She and her husband had bought a small place in the suburbs with a garden she was already planning and rooms they hoped to fill. We have news, she said as I sat at their kitchen table, feeling awkward and grateful in equal measure. They were expecting their first child, due in the spring. I want my kids to know their grandfather, Emma said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. I want them to understand that love isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes love is quiet and careful and shows up in ways you don't expect. Sometimes it lets you have exactly what you need, even when you're too stubborn to ask for it. Love doesn't shout. It just shows up, quietly, when it matters most. Some fathers walk their daughters down the aisle. Others just make sure the aisle exists. Both kinds of love matter. Both kinds last. And sometimes the best way to love someone is to let them discover for themselves that they've been loved all along. I didn't need to walk her down the aisle. I just needed to make sure. It existed. Time didn't take my place. It revealed it. She once told me I'd make things awkward. Now she asks if I'm free on Sundays.